going to talk about the soldier photographers of the First World War. We're going to concentrate on British soldier photographers. We're going to have a look at how their photographs made it into the press, the attitude of the authorities towards soldier photographers, and how this amateur work sits alongside that of professional official photographers who came on stream during the First World War. At the end, I'll go through some typical subjects, themes that are captured across the collections of photographs taken by soldier photographers in the First World War. All of the collections and images we're going to look at tonight are in the collections of the Imperial War Museum. As I've said, they're looking at British Army personnel. We're looking at 11 individual photographers' work. They're pretty representative of the material we have in the collection, different theatres of war and different periods of the war as well. So I'll start off by looking at the state of photography in 1914. Well, by the end of the 19th century, photography had become a popular pastime. And you can look at the actual take-up of photography. If you look at the profits that the Kodak company were making, in 1895, they made £49,000 profit. 1914, they made £2.4 million profit. So photography had really taken off as this pastime for people. And this is because it was possible to buy a basic box brownie camera for 5 shillings. And technical developments went along to help photography come to a mass audience. For instance, small lightweight cameras were developed, and roll film, and much faster shutter speeds, improved exposure times, and better lenses. So you didn't have to have one of these huge, great glass plate cameras on a tripod, etc. You could have something that you could easily carry around and take your photographs with. And in fact, in 1899, Kodak introduced a folding camera, which produced a postcard-sized photographic print. In 1912, they produced this camera here, which is the vest pocket Kodak. That's my iPhone, so it folds down, and it's about the same size as a modern day iPhone. It's very robust metal construction, got retractable bellows, and it took a roll film and produced a relatively small negative, and it was ideal to put in a jacket pocket. So it's a very suitable camera for somebody basically to take to war. 1915, they improve that and they bring up what is called the autographic vest pocket Kodak, and this is one of these because it's got a little stylus. So the idea was that when you took a photograph, you have a little flap here which you flip up, and there is a piece of paper across the negative, and you take your stylus and you actually can write a caption onto your neg, so you don't actually forget what the photograph you've taken is. And of course, when that's printed, it prints the negative in white along the bottom of the photograph. This was the most popular private camera of the First World War, and in 1915 Kodak were marketing this as the soldier's camera. It cost about 30 shillings. So if you think of an average weekly wage of a skilled industrial worker was 40 shillings, and a labourer between 10 and 15 shillings, it wasn't prohibitive. Quite a wide range of people could afford to save up and buy a camera. Another manufacturer, British manufacturer, making cameras for servicemen was Houghton's, and Houghton's produced this camera, the Ensignet. And again, it folds down into something that's about the size of a cigarette case. And again, you could put it into your pocket. This was introduced in 1907. And adverts stressed the durability and flexibility of that camera. So that's the sort of equipment that was available. But if we look at other developments, photojournalism was on the rise just before the First World War. In 1904, the Daily Mirror opened, and the Daily Mirror pioneered the photojournalist profession. Most of the pieces in the Daily Mirror had photographs there, and there were pre-war photo competitions for amateur photographers with cash prizes. For instance, in 1912 and 13, the Daily Mail offered a £1,000 prize for the best holiday photograph taken with a Kodak camera. And when you think, you know, £1,000, that was a massive amount of money back in those days. I mean, I wouldn't mind winning that now. But back in 1912-13, that was a huge amount of money to get a photograph in the press. Obviously, with the coming of war in 1914, it was obvious the press would be hungry for images of the conflict. And because of these lightweight cameras, it meant that there were not an insignificant number of soldiers going to war taking cameras with them. And they wanted to do this, not necessarily to get them published, but they wanted to document their exploits of this basically historic event. Overwhelmingly, the men with cameras were officers, both professional soldiers and 1914 Kitchener volunteers. And we're just going to introduce you now to the men whose photography we're going to look at. Firstly, Lieutenant Robert Cotton Money, professional soldier joining the Cameronians in 1909, took photographs up till he was wounded in middle of 1915. Sent his films back to Glasgow for processing, and then at the end of the war he was out in the Caucasus and started taking photographs again. So his photographs are really 1914-15 and then 18-19. Sergeant Christopher Pilkington, he was a professional photographer and friends with a lieutenant in the Scots Guards, and the Scots Guards wanted to take their own photographer to France to document their war effort, to basically illustrate their regimental history. And Pilkington, as a professional, was taken along and served with the battalion up until March 1915, when he returned to England. But his photographs are very, very good quality. Obviously, as a professional photographer, had good professional camera. Cyril Alexander Fraser Drummond, an officer with the Royal Field Artillery, commissioned in August 1914. He took part in the Christmas truce and documented that event. One of the soldiers to document that famous event of Christmas 1914. Herbert Preston, another artillery officer. He was a territorial officer, but then transferred into the Royal Field Artillery on the outbreak of war, and requested his wife send out his camera when he was at the front, and she did this in a food parcel, packing it between a ham and a fruitcake, and just to protect it. He took many photographs during his time with the battery, and he was actually selling his photographs to the press for publication. Captain Basil Pears, he was commissioned into the King's Own Royal Lancaster Regiment. He served in 4 different battalions. He was wounded a number of times, and that meant he kept going back to where there were gaps. So he moved around between about 3 or 4 battalions of the regiment, and served on the Western Front from 1915 all the way through the war. Died at the early age of 31 in 1924 from the results of his wounds and infection that actually set in after the war. Jess Spire. Jess Spire is the chap standing on the left at the back with the pipe in his mouth. Before the war, he was organist at the chapel at Sandhurst, served in Gallipoli, and then in Macedonia, i.e. the Salonika campaign, and took a number of photographs of that campaign. Really, really good photographs in and around the front line. Lachlan Lyndon Bell, the Seaforth Highlanders, was at Marlborough College when the war broke out, went to Sandhurst and then joined the 1st Battalion of the Seaforths, fought in France, Mesopotamia and Palestine, and took some really good photographs in France and Mesopotamia. he was, again, he stayed in the army after the war and ended up as a colonel. There's one man we don't have an image of, who is Lieutenant Alfred Andrew, who's a medical officer and was at Gallipoli. He always stayed behind the camera, so we don't have any images of him, but his photographs you'll see from Gallipoli are very, very good. This officer here, Henry Jourdain, 5th Connaught Rangers, he was their commanding officer at Gallipoli and in the Balkans, and he actually wrote the history of the Connaught Rangers after the war as well. He also kept a diary of his time in Salonika, and it's one of the only accounts. His photographs and diary are some of the only accounts of the early days of the Salonika campaign in the mountains of Serbia in late 1915. Percy Elgee, he is one of the few other ranks that we have here. Served with the Somerset Light Infantry, went out to India on garrison duty, took lots of photographs there, and then followed that up in Mesopotamia for the remainder of the war. And finally, Lieutenant Beavis Haggard, born into a military family, and he and his brother served in the 7th Queens. He was wounded 3 times during the war, remained with his regiment after the First World War, and went on to serve in India, China, and at Malta. He died in 1944. He actually went down. He was serving in the Middle East in 1941 and went down with heat stroke and a heart attack in Syria. It was evacuated to the UK, but never truly recovered. And as I say, died 4th of February 1944. But his photograph album is a particularly good one. You'll see a couple of really, really interesting photographs from his album later on. So let's have a look at the soldier photographer's work and the press. So as I say, with the outbreak of war, there was an instant demand for photographs and images of the conflict, and the papers were looking to increase their circulation as people were hungry for war news. Now, papers and publishers began producing illustrated war titles pretty soon after the war began, and the War Illustrated, for example, the first edition of that weekly sort of photo magazine came out on the 22nd of August 1914, so very, very soon after the war began. These were sold as historical souvenir records of the war, as well as sort of a newspaper of events. And the War Illustrated soon had a circulation of 750,000 copies per week. So it was a good money earner for the newspapers and publishing houses. The problem was, of course, these were photo-driven or image-driven magazines and journals, but no journalists or photographers accompanied the BEF to France in 1914. And in fact, Sir John French hated the press and he wanted to keep them away. He thought they were a bloody nuisance and he didn't want them anywhere near the army. So it was very, very difficult to get wartime photographs. They overcame this to some extent in the early days by using pre-war photographs of training sessions, etc. And this is a typical image, pre-war image of French troops, but repackaged as a wartime photograph. Most of these images from the early days from press agencies are of French and German troops. The British troop photographs are normally of soldiers training in the UK before they actually go overseas. When we were looking at action images, obviously very difficult to get cameramen into the front line. So they relied on war sort of illustrators to produce these sort of old style illustrations. These are the sort of things that, you know, people who followed the Boer War or even the Zulu War and conflicts, you know, in the 19th century would have seen in things like the Illustrated London News. So these were very popular to get that sort of immediacy of action in the First World War. So the lack of real images meant that the press were really, really keen to get hold of photographs taken by soldiers. What they wanted was images from the front line. they didn't want snapshots posed behind the trenches. They wanted people in the front line, uncensored, immediately, immediate capture of a moment. That's what they're really after. And the War Illustrated, on the 21st of November 1914, published in the British media the first true in-action photograph of the First World War. And it was a photograph taken by Robert Money. And here it is from the Imperial War Museum collection, taken during the Battle of the Marne. But this isn't how it was published. It was published like this. So you can see an explosion has been put in. They've doctored the image for sort of more dramatic effect. And soon papers were offering cash prizes. The Daily Sketch, which had a circulation of 1 million copies, had a prize pot of £10,000 to offer to soldiers for the best war photographs. And the Daily Mirror was offering £1,000 for photographs in February 1915. It also said that they would develop the films for free and they would guarantee anonymity for the photographer, just in case he got into trouble with commanding officers and people more senior in the military. And we can see Robert Money, a number of his photographs made it into the press. And here we have an example, staff conference of officers just before the Battle of Le Cateau. And you can see the actual photograph, and then you can see it on the right published in a magazine. And similar here for these chaps looking out through Cabbage Patch Trench. And you can see why it's called Cabbage Patch Trench is that you can see the view, another one of Robert Money's photographs, looking actually through the cabbages, which is giving them some sort of camouflage just above the parapet of the trench. But we don't know what Robert Money was paid, if he was paid for these photographs. But we do know that soldiers were being paid. A few years ago, we got a collection of photographs, camera, and documents relating to Herbert Preston. And we've got his negatives, prints, pocket diary, bills of sale, and account sheets. So we know from these documents that he sold around 70 to 80 of his photographs in various publications for between 7 and 11 shillings each. And in the first month of him selling his home photographs, he made around £28, which doubled his second lieutenant's salary for that month. Now, his wife acted as a point of contact for the press, and she used a false name. So she was, all of the paperwork is addressed to Mrs. Maxwell. And some inquiries were sent to Preston and his wife by readers in the newspaper. And the pictorial press, for instance, sent, when this particular photograph of this trench dog was photographed, some Belgian refugees then in the UK actually wrote to say, we think we recognise that dog. Do you know who the soldiers are in the photographs? And they perhaps can tell me where they got the dog, because we had to leave our dog behind in Belgium. We haven't got any evidence that Herbert Preston ever answered that, but it's interesting to see that there's that correspondence going between the newspaper or press agency and the photographer. So what was the attitude of the British military to soldiers with cameras in the British Army? Well, the lack of official photography created an appetite in the press, as we've said, but the War Office and political leaders were slow to appreciate the role of photographs as propaganda weapons. And it was only in 1915 that Kitchener allowed a small number of journalists to go to General Headquarters in France. As I mentioned, Sir John French wasn't keen on this. He thought that they were a security risk, they'd take photographs they shouldn't, and that if these weren't heavily censored, information would get to the enemy. And on the 22nd of December 1914, General Routine Order 464 was issued, which banned soldiers from having contact with the press. The main reason things started to go wrong is that was just before the Christmas truce, but obviously during the Christmas truce, a number of photographs were taken and a number of them got into the newspapers. This event really focused the minds of the authorities on the need for a camera ban, as the amateur photographs were the only record of this event, which the army didn't want to publicise, the fraternisation with the enemy. Major problem was, of course, propaganda messages are ramping up, and we've had all this negative propaganda against the beastly Hun. And this shows British and German soldiers fraternising, getting on with each other in no man's land. It's sort of at odds with that propaganda message, which is growing. So we really need to start clamping down on photographs, especially photographs getting into the press. And in March 1915, the War Office issued an instruction in an attempt to ban soldiers carrying cameras. And there was a War Office instruction the following month doing the same thing. And in September 1915, a couple of weeks before the Battle of Loos, General Routine Order 1137 came out saying no military personnel or other person subject to military law is permitted to be in possession of a camera. So really now they are clamping down big time in the British Army on people with their own cameras. So if you were caught with a camera after that routine order was issued, what could happen to you? Well, you could be charged under Section 40 of the Army Act, which was which covered miscellaneous military offences that with conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline. This was deliberately vague. It was a catch-all term to deal with crimes not covered under other existing military law. And you could get, as another rank, you could get from 40 to 112 days detention for taking photographs. Officers faced possible cashiering from the army, which was a total disgrace, especially if you wanted to make the army your profession going forward. An example of a soldier who was caught with a camera, Private Cyril Cook of the 15th Londons, was caught with a camera in February 1916. He was in confinement for 2 weeks. He was accused of disobeying the general routine order, found guilty, but only given 28 days field punishment number 2 and then returned to his unit. So really, although they had stiff penalties, they weren't really enforcing it seriously against anybody who actually had a camera. A lot of people who were professional soldiers, people like Robert Money, this is the time when these men sent their cameras home because they did worry about their future military career. But luckily, a lot of men still decided to take the risk and carry cameras, and it's very important that they did, because 1914, 15 into 16, there were no official photographers around. So we only have these amateur photographs to show the British Army in the First World War at that time. It does appear that a lot of men carried cameras, but they were more discreet about using them. For example, other ranks didn't tend to take photographs when officers were around, and officers didn't flourish their cameras in front of senior officers. Although we do know that battalion commanders knew that officers in their battalion still had cameras, because quite often the battalion commander is in the photographs, so he knew he was being photographed. And normally it seems that they turned a blind eye as long as they knew that the chap with the camera was a good chap and he wouldn't take his camera into action, he wouldn't take photographs of things he shouldn't be taking photographs of. So there was this blind eye being turned. The instructions and the banning of cameras is more restrictive on the Western Front. As you get further and further away into more obscure theatres of war, there are less and less sort of restrictions of men carrying cameras. Yes, they did send round general routine orders saying, please send your cameras home. most people ignored them, and just about everybody got away with it. So that's pretty much how the British Army were actually dealing with it. And the great thing about those other theatres of war, of course, is there were less official photographers available in these theatres from 1916. So really, the soldiers' record of Salonika, Palestine, Mesopotamia is vital all the way through the war, whereas it isn't so much on the Western Front, because at least there is the 14, 15, 16 official photographers down on the British side. So how does the work of these soldiers' photographers sit alongside that of official photographers? Well, the first official British photographer of the First World War was Ernest Brooks. He was appointed in March 1916. He was a former photojournalist with the Daily Mirror. He joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve in 1914 and was commissioned as a lieutenant. He was appointed by Churchill as official Admiralty photography in Gallipoli. And then that really made him the obvious choice in 1960 to become the first British official photographer. He already had that military photography experience. Given the rank of second lieutenant, he was sent to France to cover the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. By the end of the war, there were 16 British official photographers on the Western Front. Both the Germans and the French employed many more photographers, and they were also a lot more lax on soldiers having cameras, especially the Germans. The Germans almost encouraged their troops to carry private cameras. All of the men appointed in 1916-17 by the British were pre-war photojournalists, including colleagues of Brooks who'd been with the Daily Mirror, and they included William Ivor Castle and William Ryder. Australia, Canada and New Zealand also appointed their own official photographers, and they covered the Western Front and Egypt and Palestine. Of course, Brooks and these men took some of the iconic images of the First World War, this being one of them, this stretcher bearer group on Pilcombe Ridge during the Third Battle of Ypres. As pre-war photojournalists, all of these men knew what was acceptable in terms of a press photograph, and they avoided graphic subjects on the whole, such as the dead, especially Allied dead, and the worst of the battlefield conditions. There was almost a pre-war code of conduct between press photographers where they sort of self-censored what they took photographs of. These men were professionals, and they realised their job was to report on the war as the government wanted it reported. They knew they were producing propaganda images, and their work was part of the British war effort. The Australian war photographers were slightly different. They had a slightly different brief in that Charles Bean wanted a total photographic record of Australia at war. So they had a wider range of subjects to take, even if they knew that some of those photographs would not make it into the press during the war. Bean had an eye to post-war and getting the Australian record in place in perpetuity. Frank Hurley was one of the Australian photographers, and he was censored. He was on the Western Front initially, and he was creating photo montages. What he was trying to do was capture the immediacy of mechanized warfare at a time when professional camera equipment made this very, very difficult. So what he was doing was he was montaging sort of photographs of troops going over the top with other photographs of explosions, photographs of aeroplanes flying off, and putting all this together in one image. But this was seen as sort of fakery. So he was sent off to the Middle East, where they thought he would be out of the way and do sort of like less harm to that sort of war record. So that's the official photographers and what they're capturing. So what do the amateurs give us that the official photographs don't? Well, of course, as I've said, before Ernest Brooks is appointed, there are no official photographs. So for 1914 and 1915, we are dependent on the works of these soldier photographers. They cover the early battles of the war and the response to the first use of gas. The Christmas truce, as we've seen, was covered by a number of men. And even after 1916, of course, there are a limited number of official photographers, which means that many battalions are just in the wrong place at the wrong time and never pop up in an official photograph. So if they've got their own photographer or an officer with them, at least they have some war record in terms of images. These amateur photographers also capture visual coverage of events that might be missed. For example, Henry Jourdain, there were no photographers in Serbia with the British Army in late 1915. There was an official photographer, but he was down at the base. So this is very much an uncaptured part of the war up in Serbia. The other thing, of course, is that soldiers' photographs are a lot more relaxed and natural rather than the official photographs, but because, of course, the men in the photographs are friends and comrades of the photographer, rather than just happen to be there when the official photographer turns up and says, "Oh, come on, chaps, I want a quick image of you." So he's not. So it's not. They're not invading. They're not sort of invasive of the space. They're like friends of the guys in the pictures. So it's a lot more naturalistic. The other thing, of course, is if you look at a lot of the official photographs, the names of people, quite often the names of the units, some of the locations, have either been censored out by the censor or not recorded by the photographer because it wasn't part of his remit to do that. But of course, in private photograph albums, we're very lucky in that people recorded quite often the names of individuals in the images, which obviously makes the photographs much more useful to the museum, to researchers, etc. And that's why it's done, because there is no sort of, technically these guys are not going through the censorship here. They're producing it for their own use and for the use of friends and a record for their sort of like later life. So that is why these photographs are a really important part of the war record, even though perhaps the quality of the photographs isn't as good as people like Brooks with his nice press camera with glass plate negatives. So if we look across the many collections that we have at the Imperial War Museum, there are a number of themes and subjects of the photographs that pop up time and time again. I'm going to show you some of the images here. Firstly, there is the journey to the front. And this can be leaving the UK or garrison camps, modes of transport to the front, and approaches to the front line. So here we have one of Christopher Pilkington's photographs of the Scots Guards leaving the Tower of London, and Scots Guards here on troop ship heading across to France. And again, actually in France now, moving up through into Belgium, civilians watching the British Army as it goes towards the front line. Then, of course, fantastic photograph here from Robert Money capturing the London buses. And he's actually captured the buses before they've been repainted and before the windows on the lower decks have actually been boarded up. So fantastic that they've still got those adverts on the buses. And of course, further afield, we have travelling up the Tigris. Typical mode of travel up the Tigris was by river steamer, but the river steamers were too small. So what they tended to do was lash two big barges on the sides, pack them full of infantrymen or cavalry, and to come up the Tigris that way. And of course, we also have to deal with animal transport, and we've got a couple of fantastic photographs here of animals being winched either on board or being disembarked. And I can just imagine, you know, how sort of moody camels get. I wouldn't have wanted to go anywhere near that camel after it had landed 4 feet on the ground. We also have sort of travelogue photographs, you know, places, people, etc., that they met. The greater number of these pictures were taken away from the Western Front. Obviously, France and Belgium was not too different from sort of rural Britain in a way. So quite often the photographs are for more far-flung locations. But in France and Belgium, we do get photographs of people that soldiers were billeted with, and also refugees moving through, and destruction. Destruction caused to buildings by the war, rather than photographs of standard buildings. So here we have a couple of photographs, one of some Belgians who ran an estaminet, and one of the Sheikh of Zubair and his followers, as some of the British soldiers were actually asked to go hunting with them while they're in Mesopotamia. Here, of course, the iconic Market Square of Ypres. This is obviously a photograph in 1914 when the buildings are not too badly damaged. In fact, at this time, the Belgians were still trying to repair the buildings because they didn't realise how destructive the war was going to be. The photograph, Ezra's Tomb. Ezra's Tomb is probably the most photographed building in Mesopotamia because it sits on the bank of the Tigris. People going up the river going up the Tigris on one of these river steamers, there was very little to see until suddenly you came across Ezra's Tomb. And if you had a camera, you took a photograph of it before you went off into nothingness again as you went further up the river. Couple of photographs here, one in France and one of the famous arch of the Emperor Galerius in Salonika, or Thessaloniki as it is today. That is obviously still there, although the road has now been moved. But that arch is still there, and I see that every year when I go out to Salonika. We also have shots of life in the front line. These are great because we get details of trench construction, everyday life in the line, conditions in the trenches, and details of equipment, trench weapons, etc., across all the different theatres of war. Brilliant sources for detail, for researchers, for TV programmes, feature films, etc., etc. A very wide range of usage these photographs have got. So we can compare here Western Front and Mesopotamia. Different types of weapons and gun and use of camouflaged emplacements, etc. Periscopic rifles, of course, famously used in Gallipoli as well as on the Western Front. And artillery observation, again on the Western Front in a ruined farmhouse, and at Gallipoli. And off-duty moments, making tea in the trenches, and similarly sitting around in the mud in January in Mesopotamia after really, really heavy rain. Battalion HQ, literally just a few boxes stacked above the mud alongside the Tigris. Another great photograph, two great photographs here showing details of trench scenes, periscopes there, a shell case used as a gas gong, etc. Really, really, really good photograph. I always think the guy on the left-hand photograph in Salonika, the chap in the middle, reminds me a bit of David Gower. So perhaps one of his ancestors was in the 7th South Wales Borderers, who knows? And here's a shot down the reverse slope of Costarino Ridge up in Serbia, and an idea of the really, really shallow trenches which were all the Irish troops were able to dig before the Bulgarians attacked them. A couple of photographs here from Basil Pears. Basil Pears seemed to have been very, very interested in trying to photograph shell explosions, and there are a number of his images show shell bursts in the air. So he must have waited for bombardments and just tried to capture these images on his vest pocket Kodak. And we've got a fantastic photograph here of a soldier being pulled out of a collapsed dugout. I mean, obviously this happened time and time again. Shells would come down, crash a dugout, and then it was a race to dig these guys out as fast as you can. And again, Pears, being a good officer, let the men do the digging while he takes a photograph. We also have pictures of battle. Now, these are, I have to say, these are quite rare in terms of both official and private photographs. Normally, you get the sort of preparation or the aftermath of a trench raid or an attack, sort of like these photographs here. And in fact, this Gordon Highlanders patrol photograph, I think, is probably is probably fake. But it does give you an impression of this sort of early period of the war and how the men were going into the line. This is one of my favourite photographs. This is by Lyndon Bell. Doesn't look like much, but this is they've come under heavy fire from Turkish trenches in this billiard flat plain alongside the Tigris when they're trying to relieve the town of Kut. They've come under heavy fire and they've had to get down and build head cover, scrape some head cover, and these soldiers were then stuck in this position until nightfall, and then the Turkish snipers and machine gunners couldn't see them. So Lyndon Bell is obviously in a bored moment. He's just decided to get his get his camera out of his pocket and just photograph the two guys lying next to him, just to waste a couple of minutes while he's sort of lying there for hours and hours until it gets dark. These are two brilliant photographs taken by Bevis Haggard, taken on the 1st of July 1916 during the Battle of the Somme on Montauban Road, advancing on Montauban Alley. This was the part of the British front where everything went right on the first day of the Somme. All the objectives were captured. This is basically alongside the French. So the British units here were supported by better French artillery, which helped them achieve their objectives. And these are some of the only photographs that we've got of actual in-action photographs taken on the 1st of July 1916. And the photograph caption says this is the advance on Montauban Road, just before the final advance on Montauban Alley, time about 3:30 p.m. The officers seen are Lieutenant C.A. Haggard, D.R. Heaton, and an officer of the 7th Buffs. The men are 7th Queens and 7th Buffs intermingled. And then the other photograph is actually the troops on their final position. So this is Montauban Alley Trench, taken about 6 p.m. And this is the photographs in the album. And now we'd had this album for a number of years at the museum, but it was only in 2014 that I was going through photograph albums held up at Duxford, and I came across this album because we'd had an inquiry about the Haggard brothers and their photo album. I went through the photograph album and saw 1st of July 1916, and these were these two photographs. So we got them digitized just in time for the First World War centenary, and both of them are now copies of these photographs are in the First World War gallery in Lambeth Road in the main museum building. Fantastic images to have in the collection. We also have photographs of the cost of war. Here are some men coming out of the line looking absolutely dead tired. The officers look fine because they haven't been in the line, but the two soldiers coming out carrying this equipment are just looking absolutely knackered after their spell of time in the front line. Cost of war, as I say, we've got battlefield casualties, dead animals, etc. This is after a shell strike at Cape Helles at Gallipoli. Again, casualties, one of the first casualties in October 1914, and then a great photograph taken by Alfred Andrew of an operation taking place at a field ambulance post in Gully Ravine, Gallipoli. A really, really interesting photograph there. And this photograph of British dead on V Beach 2 days after the initial landings at Gallipoli. And a couple of Gallipoli historians have said this is the earliest photograph they've seen of casualties at Gallipoli. And these are men who were killed coming ashore at V Beach on the 25th of April. It's an amazing photograph captured by Alfred Andrew. Basil Pears, he took a number, as well as those shots of shell bursts, he did capture a number of images of the dead on the Arras battlefield, both German and British dead, mingled in shell holes, etc. Another one, he decided that was something that had to be captured. We also have pictures of battlefield cemeteries. Now these are very, very useful, especially the early ones, because of course, if the war has swept over this area, 1916, 1917, 1918, quite often these graves would be lost, and these men will now be recorded on a memorial to the missing. But this does show that these men were initially buried by their comrades and commemorated. So quite often it's nice to see this original location of burial before more formal commemorations by the CWGC. Of course, we also have off-duty and humorous side of war. People have said about the First World War, it was 95% boredom and 5% extreme violence. And photographers obviously captured this off-duty moments, probably as an anecdote to traumatic events happening on the battlefield. And here we have a fantastic action photograph of a soldier of the 7th Battalion, South Wales Borderers, in the midst of diving into a swimming pool in a ravine in Macedonia, and of course fishing in the river Tigris in Mesopotamia. And here we have off-duty moment of a couple of officers shaving behind a haystack, and again men trying to row, have a bit of a laugh on the Tigris down near Basra. And this one's very good. This is Lieutenant Ross, who was the guy who got Charles Pilkington to go with the Scots Guards to France and Belgium. Fell asleep on the troop ship, and they basically made him out to look he's actually drunk rather than asleep. And another really nice shot taken by Herbert Preston of soldiers outside the dugout with the ubiquitous gramophone, which many soldiers and officers seem to have in their dugouts in the First World War. And that is it. So I'm quite happy to answer any questions if you've got them.